The mountains had long held secrets the rest of the world refused to acknowledge, shadows clinging to their jagged edges like old regrets. In a crumbling cabin where the wind whispered through splintered boards, a family persisted, untouched by time, untouched by conscience. Generations of blood had wound themselves into a tapestry of deformity and obsession, each child a pale echo of the last, each mind sharpened by isolation and darkness. He was born into this cursed lineage, a boy with hollow eyes that seemed to watch the world but never quite belonged to it. Even as a child, his presence unnerved the village beyond the hilltops. Mothers hushed their children when his silhouette appeared against the dusk, and strangers hurried past, pretending not to notice the cabin that seemed to exhale unease with every gust of wind. Among the few faces he knew, one shone with a fragile light. His niece, barely old enough to understand the world, her innocence clashing violently with the oppressive shadows of their home. He watched her from the corners of rooms, along winding paths in the forest, his gaze too knowing, too deliberate, until fear began to pulse quietly behind her wide eyes. Within the family, no one protested. Silence had become obedience, and obedience had become tradition. Old whispers of ritual, of blood, of inheritance, coiled through the generations until morality was just a faint echo. Outside the cabin, the forest stirred, restless, as if sensing the wrongness in the air. The mountains seemed to lean closer, eavesdropping on the impossible, waiting for the inevitable to unfold. And in the stillness of that cursed home, the first steps of a terrifying story began, one that would bend innocence into horror, and bind the bloodline ever tighter in ways the world outside would never forgive. The mountains that stretched across the horizon were more than just a backdrop of rugged terrain, they were a fortress of secrets, a place where the sun barely touched the valleys and the wind carried whispers of lives long past. Within their shadowed folds, a family had survived for generations, isolated from the rest of the world, their existence a tangled web of silence and tradition. No road led directly to their homestead, only narrow paths choked by thickets and overgrown brush, paths that seemed to vanish when anyone unfamiliar tried to follow them. The family's isolation had not only preserved their way of life but had allowed a dark, unnatural pattern to take root, one that had been passed down quietly through the bloodline like an unspoken inheritance. Children were born pale and fragile, their bodies and minds shaped by years of repeated intermarriage, a genetic legacy that had become both curse and identity. The elders of the family rarely ventured beyond the mountains, and when they did, they carried with them a guarded pride, a certainty that the world outside could never understand the rules that governed their lives. They cultivated their own customs, their own sense of order, within the decaying walls of their home, and the forest seemed to conform to their rhythms, the trees bending in ways that created natural barriers, keeping outsiders at bay and their secrets tightly sealed. Villagers in the surrounding hollows told stories of the family in hushed tones, half in fear and half in awe, tales of children who grew too quickly, of pale faces and strange habits, of rituals that no one dared witness but all seemed to know about. The family did not need to explain themselves, the mountains did it for them. The land itself became a character, shaping the people who lived upon it, hardening them, isolating them, enforcing a sense of destiny that intertwined with the natural world. Seasons passed with an unrelenting rhythm, the winters harsh and unyielding, the summers brief and shadowed, and each year the family's customs became more insular, more rigid, as though the mountains themselves demanded it. Within the cabin that perched precariously on a slope overlooking a dense forest, generations of inbreeding had woven a silent, invisible network of control and inheritance. Every glance, every gesture, carried echoes of the past, every birth carried with it the weight of what had come before. And so the family persisted, unseen and unchecked, thriving in the shadow of the mountains, bound together by blood, tradition, and the oppressive gravity of the wilderness that surrounded them, a world apart from law, morality, and the judgment of the outside world, existing entirely within the dark, self-sustaining ecosystem they had created for themselves. He was born on a night when the wind howled through the mountains like a chorus of ancient voices, carrying with it a chill that seemed to seep into the very bones of the cabin. His mother, pale and trembling, had labored in silence, attended only by the watchful eyes of those who understood the family's dark history. From the moment he drew his first breath, there was something in his gaze that unsettled even those accustomed to the oddities of their lineage. His eyes were unusually large, too knowing, as though they had seen and absorbed the weight of generations before him. His skin was sallow and thin, and his limbs seemed delicate yet stiff, betraying the repeated cycles of bloodline that had shaped him long before he was conceived. The elders whispered softly among themselves, acknowledging the traits that marked him as both a continuation and a warning, a child born under the heavy hand of inheritance, carrying the accumulated consequences of generations of inbreeding. As he grew, his movements were deliberate and unnerving, his silence more eloquent than any words he might have spoken. He observed everything with an intensity that made even adults hesitate in his presence, and his ability to recall minute details, faces, gestures, conversations suggested a mind sharpened by isolation and obsessive attention. The other children in the household kept their distance, sensing the weight of something both familiar and profoundly wrong in his presence. Even the animals seemed uneasy around him, skittish and withdrawn, as though recognizing the unnatural pattern of his existence. Education came not from books or schools, but from the whispered instructions of the elders and the rigid routines of the household. He learned the customs, the unspoken rules, the coded ways in which the family communicated without ever leaving the safety of the cabin walls. He became a mirror of his ancestors, a living embodiment of their legacy, pale and silent, yet calculating in ways that would define the trajectory of his life. Outsiders rarely saw him, and when they did, their descriptions were tinged with fear: a boy too quiet, too still, a presence that did not quite belong to the ordinary world. Even at an age when other children would have been curious and carefree, he exhibited a focus that bordered on obsession, particularly regarding those he considered part of the bloodline he was destined to protect and perpetuate. There was a sense that he was aware, in some deep, instinctive way, of the role he would play within the family's dark narrative, a role that would intertwine innocence and transgression in ways no one outside the cabin could comprehend. The house, the forest, the mountains themselves seemed to bend around him, shaping his movements, reinforcing the patterns that had defined his family for centuries, until he was not just a child, but the next inevitable chapter in a story written in blood and silence. The village that lay in the hollows below the mountains had long learned to speak of the family in whispers, as though the sound of their voices might summon something they were better off leaving undisturbed. Every generation, rumors grew more elaborate, fueled by half-seen shapes in the forest, fleeting glances through misted windows, and the stories that children passed along in trembling excitement. Mothers would hush their little ones when the wind carried a certain low whistle or when a shadow moved oddly across the hills, warning them that some things were best left alone. Merchants and travelers who passed through the area spoke of the cabin perched high on a slope, of a family that seemed to exist in its own time, its members pale, silent, and watchful. Occasionally, someone reported seeing children who seemed too old for their age or adults whose mannerisms carried an almost unnatural stiffness, movements precise but lacking warmth. These accounts were often dismissed with nervous laughter, but beneath the amusement lay a persistent unease. The villagers knew the family's reputation for secrecy extended beyond simple pride. There was fear behind the closed shutters and the unwelcoming stares. The cabin was more than a home, it was a bastion of rules that outsiders could neither comprehend nor challenge. Travelers claimed to hear low chanting in the dead of night or glimpses of figures moving through the tree line with a mechanical grace that defied normal human behavior. And yet, no one dared approach directly, for stories of past confrontations had left scars in the collective memory. Neighbors who ventured too close had returned shaken, pale, and sometimes never at all. The whispers told of rituals, of unions, and births that were hidden from the eyes of the world, of behaviors that skirted morality and law, yet persisted unchecked because the mountains themselves seemed to protect them. Even within the village, there was a recognition that proximity to the family's world was dangerous. Gossip traveled fast, but it carried a weight that made people tread lightly, speaking truths only when the family could not overhear. Children learned the stories as lessons, teaching them to avoid curiosity that might lead them too far into the forest or too close to the cabin. The villagers felt a mixture of fascination and horror, a grim acknowledgement that such a family could exist unchecked, their customs preserved in isolation, generations of inbreeding unchecked, their legacy an invisible scar on the community. Despite the fear, a morbid curiosity persisted, and travelers sometimes attempted to peer over ridges or listen for secrets carried by the wind. Every glimpse or half-heard tale reinforced the sense that the family was more than human, more than ordinary, and yet tragically human in their own twisted way. The mountains held them, the cabin protected them, and the whispers of the village ensured that the family's presence loomed over the area like a shadow, shaping the lives of those who dared live too close to the line where isolation, obsession, and darkness converged. As he grew older, the young man's world contracted and twisted around the people and objects he considered his own, and none held more significance in his mind than his niece. From the earliest days of her life, he had observed her with a gaze that was both unnervingly intense and disturbingly calculating, noting every small gesture, every expression, every moment of vulnerability. It was not a brotherly or uncle-like affection that drove him, but something far more possessive, a fixation rooted in the family's insular way of thinking, where bloodlines were sacred, unbroken, and preserved above all else. He watched her as she played near the cabin, as she wandered through the narrow paths of the surrounding woods, silent and invisible in the shadows, always attentive, always present, as though she were a part of the architecture of his existence rather than an independent being. The girl, unaware of the depth of his attention, regarded him with a mixture of trust and timidity, her small frame fragile against the weight of the household that had shaped her. She had been raised in a world governed by unspoken rules, a world where the lines between care and control were blurred, where obedience was learned before speech, and fear had an intimate relationship with love. Yet even within that distorted normalcy, there was a subtle, instinctive awareness in her that drew her gaze away from him at times, that made her small hands fidget or her voice falter when he approached. He noticed these reactions, catalogued them silently, interpreting them as signs of her innocence and, in his mind, her compliance. Within the walls of the cabin, other family members remained complicit, either through indifference, fear, or their own adherence to the twisted customs that had defined their lineage for generations. They did not intervene, and their silence became a tacit affirmation, allowing the young man's obsession to grow unchecked. Each interaction, each shared glance, reinforced the unnatural hierarchy he had created in his mind, positioning himself as the guardian, the arbiter, and ultimately the possessor of her life. The forest surrounding the cabin became his domain, a private theater where he could observe her without interference, mapping her movements and reactions as meticulously as one would trace the lines of a map. This fixation was both subtle and pervasive, a quiet force that shaped the girl's world before she could even recognize it. His presence loomed in every shadowed corner, every whispered instruction from the elders, every tradition reinforced under the pretense of family loyalty. And as he grew stronger, more assured in the patterns of control the family had ingrained in him, his obsession evolved, moving beyond mere observation into something darker, something that threatened to bind the girl irrevocably to the legacy of their bloodline in ways that neither innocence nor escape could ever undo. The first encounter between him and his niece that carried the weight of forbidden intent occurred on a late autumn afternoon, when the forest surrounding the cabin had begun to take on a bruised, shadowed hue. The air was thick with the scent of decaying leaves and damp earth, and the low sun cast long, angular shadows that seemed to stretch like fingers across the narrow paths. She had wandered slightly farther than usual, collecting wildflowers and tracing her fingers along the rough bark of the trees, unaware of the presence that had silently followed her. He emerged from the shadows without a sound, his pale face framed by the dimming light, his eyes fixed with a precision that suggested both patience and anticipation. The world seemed to contract around them, the usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves fading into a tense silence that carried the unspoken tension between predator and prey, or perhaps, in his mind, protector and ward. As she noticed him, a flicker of recognition crossed her features, quickly replaced by the instinctive caution that had been quietly growing inside her over the years. Her small hands clenched the stems of the flowers she carried, and her voice trembled as she asked where he had been, a question that barely masked her unease. He responded not with words of reassurance but with a slow, measured presence, closing the distance between them with a deliberate calm that made the air heavy. Every movement was controlled, every gesture minimal yet charged with intent. The tension was almost palpable, as though the forest itself had leaned in to observe, holding its breath alongside her. In that moment, she felt the subtle shift in his demeanor, the difference between the familiar attention of an uncle and the consuming fixation that had been quietly growing over years of observation. He guided her gently but insistently toward a hidden glade, a secluded space deep within the forest where the sun barely penetrated the thick canopy. It was a place he had chosen carefully, a domain of shadows and isolation where no witness could intrude, where the rules of the outside world held no sway. Every step reinforced her vulnerability, every glance he cast was a silent calculation, and the boundaries she had known as safe began to dissolve under the weight of his presence. Her fear, nascent but undeniable, began to pulse in the pit of her stomach, a rhythm that matched the quiet intensity of his watchfulness. Yet even as her instincts urged her to flee, there was a strange, suffocating paralysis in the atmosphere, a sense that the paths themselves had been manipulated to funnel her toward him, that the mountains and trees conspired in silence with his intentions. The encounter, brief though it was, marked a turning point, a silent declaration that innocence alone would not protect her, that the forest, the cabin, and the family were now part of a web from which she could not easily escape, and that the first step toward a darker reality had already been taken. Within the walls of the cabin, the family's complicity was as palpable as the damp, shadowed air that clung to the corners of each room. They had long cultivated a worldview in which bloodlines were sacred, and any disruption to their carefully maintained isolation was considered a threat to the family's continuity. As the young man's obsession with his niece grew more obvious to those living under the same roof, no one intervened. Instead, their silence acted as tacit approval, a reinforcement of the unnatural hierarchy that had been woven into the household over generations. The elders spoke rarely, but their words carried the weight of authority, framing the situation as adherence to tradition rather than the moral aberration it truly represented. To question it would be to question the family itself, and in a home where loyalty and obedience were demanded above all else, no dissent could survive. Their encouragement was subtle but deliberate. Conversations that outsiders might dismiss as casual guidance were actually careful manipulations designed to normalize the young man's intentions. Stories of ancestors who had married within the family were retold with pride, their deeds framed as triumphs of survival rather than acts of taboo. Rituals and customs, passed down in whispers and practiced in secret, reinforced the idea that preserving the purity of the bloodline was a duty, a sacred obligation that transcended the well-being of any individual child. The niece, still unaware of the full scope of these dynamics, was slowly being drawn into a system that treated her life and choices as extensions of the family's will rather than her own. Even the younger adults in the household, who might have recognized the wrongness of the situation, were bound by fear, custom, or simple resignation. They moved around the cabin with careful attention to appearances, following unspoken rules about what could be said, when, and to whom. Their eyes, when they glanced at the young man or the girl, carried a mixture of acknowledgement and detachment, a silent agreement that obedience was safer than confrontation. Every gesture, every nod, every suppressed sigh contributed to a climate in which the unnatural attachment could grow unchecked. Outside the cabin, the forest and mountains continued their silent watch, shaping the lives of the family and obscuring them from prying eyes. Within the home, walls and furniture bore witness to conversations, glances, and subtle acts that reinforced the hierarchy the family had created. Each member played a part, knowingly or not, in preparing the niece for a future that had been predetermined long before she could understand it. In this environment, obsession was legitimized, boundaries dissolved, and the shadow of tradition loomed large, creating a suffocating atmosphere in which the young man's intentions were not only possible but sanctioned. The family's conspiracy, quiet and pervasive, ensured that the unnatural union he sought would not only occur but be celebrated within the narrow, twisted logic of their world, sealing the niece's fate with the weight of generations. The presence of an outsider in the valley, even briefly, sent ripples of unease through the dense, suffocating atmosphere that had long enveloped the family and their secluded home. A traveling merchant had wandered farther than he intended, following a narrow, overgrown path in the hope of discovering a shortcut between the hollows, but instead he stumbled upon the fringes of a world that seemed untouched by time and uncaring of the laws that governed the outside. He noticed the cabin perched atop the slope, its weathered wood dark against the forest shadows, and the pale figures moving within, whose eyes seemed to catch his presence and linger a fraction too long before disappearing behind the doorway. Something in the air pressed down on him, a quiet tension that made the hair on his arms rise and his heart beat with an inexplicable urgency. The merchant had seen strange things in his travels, but the unnatural stillness and silent observation of the family was unlike anything he had ever encountered. Whispers began to circulate through the village when the merchant returned, tales tinged with fear and fascination. He spoke of glimpses of children who moved with unnerving precision, adults whose faces bore the pallor of long confinement, and a cabin that exuded a presence, as though the walls themselves were alive with intent. Villagers listened with a mixture of skepticism and dread, sensing truths they had always suspected but never dared articulate aloud. Some tried to dismiss his account as the exaggerations of a weary traveler, yet the merchant's descriptions matched the half-heard rumors that had circulated for generations, adding a layer of credibility to the unease they had long felt. For the family, the outsider's brief intrusion was a source of quiet tension but little real concern. They understood instinctively that their isolation and the harsh terrain surrounding them served as protection. The merchant had not fully entered their domain, had not been allowed to witness the innermost workings of their lives, and the forest seemed to conspire in ensuring that the secrets remained intact. Still, the intrusion served as a subtle reminder that the outside world, though distant and often impotent, existed and could occasionally brush against the edges of their controlled reality. This encounter intensified the careful vigilance of the household. Doors were checked, movements measured, and routines adjusted to reinforce the family's insularity. Even as the merchant's footsteps faded from the valley, the shadow of his awareness lingered, a reminder that the family's peculiar dynamics, the obsessive fixation of the young man, and the fragile innocence of the niece could, in theory, be glimpsed by someone not bound by their twisted customs. In this way, the presence of a stranger created a quiet, suffocating tension, a foreshadowing that the family's dark legacy, though protected by the mountains and forests, existed in delicate balance with the unpredictable world beyond, a world that might someday pierce the fragile veil of isolation they had so carefully constructed. As the girl grew, an awareness began to take root within her, subtle at first, like a tremor barely felt beneath the surface of her consciousness. She had spent her life within the confines of the cabin and the surrounding forest, learning the routines and observing the unspoken rules that governed her family, but something about the young man's attention unsettled her in ways that she could not fully name. The intensity of his gaze followed her everywhere, in the kitchen where she helped with the meager chores, along the narrow forest paths where she gathered herbs and berries, and even in the dim corners of her bedroom where shadows seemed to linger longer than they should. Over time, the constancy of his presence began to weigh on her, a quiet pressure that made her small body tense and her thoughts scatter, creating an instinctive wariness that contrasted sharply with the naive obedience the rest of the household demanded. She noticed how he watched her, catalogued her movements, and responded to her smallest gestures, always seeming to know what she intended before she acted. It was a subtle manipulation, one she could not yet fully articulate, but it made her feel exposed, as if every choice she made was under silent scrutiny. When she lingered too long near the forest's edge, her heart would beat faster, and she would glance over her shoulder, half expecting to see him silently emerge from the shadows. In the cabin, she began to avoid his eyes, speaking softly and quickly, careful not to draw his attention, her own movements becoming smaller, more cautious, almost rehearsed in anticipation of his observation. The elders, aware of her growing unease, said nothing, their silence serving as both instruction and warning. To question or defy the household's customs would be to invite reprimand or worse, and so she learned to internalize her fear, allowing it to shape her actions without acknowledging it aloud. Each whispered conversation, each secret glance between the adults in the household reinforced a sense of powerlessness, a quiet understanding that she was not fully her own, that the world she knew had boundaries imposed not by law or morality but by the obsessive control of the young man and the complicity of those around him. In the forest, the sense of vulnerability was even more acute. The familiar trees, the winding paths, and the hidden clearings all carried the weight of his presence. She had once felt freedom in the open spaces of the valley, but that liberty had been replaced by a taut awareness, a creeping anxiety that followed her steps. Even the bird's song and the rustling leaves seemed to echo with the possibility of his sudden appearance. Her innocence, once untroubled, began to clash violently with the dark reality surrounding her. The small, quiet fears she carried were growing into an unmistakable recognition of danger, a premonition of the oppressive and inevitable control that had been quietly tightening around her life for years, and the knowledge that the world she had known, however small, would never be the same again. The day of the marriage arrived like a shadow falling over the valley, quiet yet heavy, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath in anticipation. The ceremony was not celebrated with laughter or music, but with a ritualistic solemnity that reflected the family's rigid adherence to their own twisted customs. Within the cabin, the air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and damp earth, mingling with a tension that seemed almost tactile, pressing down on everyone present. The girl, barely 12, was dressed in a simple, pale garment that had been carefully prepared by the elders, the fabric stiff and unfamiliar against her skin. Her small hands trembled as they rested at her sides, and her eyes, wide and uncomprehending, darted toward the young man who now stood at her side, a figure both familiar and terrifying in its intensity. The family gathered around them, a silent congregation of witnesses whose expressions were unreadable yet charged with expectation. Every glance, every movement was deliberate, a reinforcement of the ritual that had been planned for years, a culmination of traditions that valued bloodline above morality, above innocence, above all else. There were no words of joy or blessing, only the quiet repetition of phrases taught over generations, words that carried meaning only within the insular logic of the household. The forest beyond the cabin remained still, the usual rustle of leaves and distant calls of birds muted, as though nature itself acknowledged the unnatural act taking place within its shadow. The young man's presence was commanding, his calm, measured demeanor contrasting sharply with the girl's obvious fear. He guided her through the motions, each step choreographed to match the long-standing patterns of their family's customs. In his mind, this was not an act of cruelty, but a fulfillment of duty, a continuation of a legacy that had been imposed on him long before he was capable of questioning it. His hands, steady and deliberate, rested briefly on hers in a gesture that he perceived as reassurance, yet it carried a weight that pressed upon her fragile body and spirit, leaving her disoriented and trapped in a reality shaped entirely by forces she could neither understand nor resist. The ceremony was brief but charged, each moment echoing with the significance the family attributed to it. Outside observers might have seen only a pair of children awkwardly aligned, yet within the cabin, every movement reverberated with meaning, every gesture a reinforcement of the hierarchy and obsession that had been cultivated over decades. As the final words of the ritual were spoken, there was no celebration, only a lingering silence that seemed to seep into the walls, the floorboards, and the very air they breathed. In that moment, the girl's life was irrevocably altered, her innocence folded into a narrative she had no power to shape. The union, sanctioned and encouraged by the family, marked a turning point from which there would be no retreat, a deliberate step into a shadowed reality where tradition, obsession, and control would converge, shaping her future in ways both immediate and far-reaching, a darkness now firmly anchored in the small cabin on the mountain slope. Even as the ceremony ended and the final murmurs of the household faded into the shadowed corners of the cabin, an unshakable sense of foreboding settled over the mountains, as though the earth itself recognized the magnitude of what had occurred. The young girl, her small frame still trembling, was now entwined in a reality she had never imagined, her life no longer her own but subsumed by the obsessive designs of the young man and the silent complicity of the family that had orchestrated the union. The forest beyond the cabin seemed to grow darker, the wind moving through the trees with a low, mournful sound that whispered of the tragedies yet to come. Each step she took, even within the familiar confines of the home, carried the weight of inevitability, a chain forged not in iron but in blood and tradition, linking her to a future shaped by secrecy, fear, and the unnatural patterns of the lineage she had been born into. The young man, now formally bound to her through the twisted logic of the family's customs, carried with him a sense of grim satisfaction, a belief that he had fulfilled a duty written long before either of them had been conceived. His presence was constant, a looming force that the girl could not evade, and the cabin, with its low ceilings and shadowed corners, became a cage in which her innocence collided with the encroaching darkness. The family continued their routines as though nothing had changed, their silence and approval reinforcing the oppressive atmosphere, allowing the obsessive control to grow without challenge. Every glance, every unspoken instruction, every careful placement of objects within the home contributed to the subtle orchestration of her confinement, shaping her perceptions and responses with quiet but relentless precision. Outside, the mountains and forests remained ever watchful, the terrain both protector and enabler, shielding the family's secrets from the scrutiny of the wider world. The villagers below sensed the shift, the intangible tension that hung over the valley, though none could articulate it fully, and none dared venture close enough to witness the consequences firsthand. Even the birds and small creatures of the forest seemed to move differently, their usual patterns disrupted by the unnatural weight of the household's new reality. The isolation that had protected the family for generations now ensured that the repercussions of their actions would unfold undisturbed, contained within the narrow, twisting paths of the valley and the shadows of the cabin. In the girl's mind, confusion and fear wrestled with faint sparks of resistance, but each moment spent in the presence of the young man and the watchful elders eroded her ability to hope for freedom. The mountains, the forest, and the walls of the cabin combined to create an inescapable theater in which innocence, obsession, and tradition were intertwined, leaving a lingering, suffocating certainty that the events set in motion would reverberate through the family for generations. The first steps into this darkness had been taken with the quiet complicity of everyone involved, and the shadow of what was to come stretched outward, foretelling a future of secrecy, manipulation, and the heavy, unyielding weight of the bloodline's inescapable legacy.